Today, we're going to tackle 15 common quilting mistakes that many beginners make, although even more experienced quilters may struggle with some of these issues as well. Hi everyone, I'm Mary from Joyful and Mary Quilting. If you're new here, I love helping quilters of all levels build their confidence with step-by-step guidance and tried and true tips. We're going to tackle 15 common quilting mistakes that many beginners make. And what's the best part? They are super easy to fix. If you've ever struggled with cutting accuracy, or maybe you've lost your triangle points, or you found yourself frustrated with wavy borders, stick around because I've got some simple solutions that will make a big difference in your quilting journey. So let's get started. I'm going to give you the 15 mistakes that are often made by beginning quilters, or even some of us more seasoned quilters. After I give you a brief synopsis of that particular mistake, there is a video that you can find on my channel or on my website that will go into more detail on this. I won't do that here. So please check out those videos and the links that are listed in the description below. I think they will be helpful. Number one, not using a pressing solution. I have Best Press, I have Terial Magic, whatever your choice is. Not using a pressing solution before cutting your fabric pieces. Use a pressing solution before cutting to prevent stretching and to help keep your pieces accurate. You need to make sure that you press, in other words, you lift and place your iron on the fabric, you don't just move it around, and that will help you to avoid distortion. The accompanying video to this tip is how to create the perfect quilt block every time, where one of the 5 tips focuses on pressing solutions. Number 2, not measuring accurately before you cut. This is so important. First of all, you need to use a well-marked ruler and always measure twice before you cut. You'll include the line on your ruler in your cut, and that's where that accuracy comes from. In other words, the line, let's say I'm cutting a 1 inch, that 1 inch line needs to be on my fabric, not to the left of my fabric, not to the right. It needs to be right on that cut edge, included. The line is included in your cut. Once I have that lined up perfectly, then I can easily make my accurate 1 inch cut. Now, sometimes we may have a ruler that doesn't have any non-skid surface on it. It might be something like an OmniGrid ruler. If you have that, if your ruler is slipping on you a little bit, you can either purchase a product called Grippy, or you can use some medical tape that you place on the bottom of your ruler, the underside, or even some True Grips or some other kind of non-skid grip that can be used on your ruler to help keep it in place. That's another way we can make mistakes. When we have a ruler that slips while we're cutting, that means our accuracy takes a toll. It is not going to be accurate if the ruler has slipped out of the way. The accompanying video is also in our workshop, How to Create the Perfect Quilt Block Every Time. Number 3, not reading the pattern first. If you take a look at any quilt pattern, in the pattern it usually will have instructions on materials that are needed, the steps you need in order to cut everything accurately, and then how to create your quilt block and eventually your quilt. You need to look over this before you even begin, just to make sure you have all the materials you need and to make sure that you are cutting everything accurately before you begin. You want to make sure you follow the pattern, and it really is helpful, for me anyway, to read through the pattern first. Just gloss over it. Make sure you understand what's expected of you, what techniques are going to be used, and then go back to the beginning, gather your materials needed, and begin cutting your fabrics. One thing that I like to do when I'm using my pattern, I can use a pencil or even a heat erasable highlighter. Friction makes those. And I highlight on my pattern what I've already completed. That way I don't repeat a step by accident. You can also use check boxes or whatever you like in order to check off each step as you have finished that particular step. You will be amazed at what a difference it will make if you keep everything organized as you're going ahead and assembling your quilt blocks and then your quilt. You will avoid a lot of mistakes just by keeping everything in order. We have a YouTube video about marking your pattern and keeping things organized called Quilt Like a Pro, 5 ways to mark and organize your quilt pattern if you'd like to take a look at more details. Number 4, sewing inconsistent 1/4 inch seams. This is huge. We need to determine the accurate 1/4 inch seam for your sewing machine. Every machine is different, every foot is different. You need to make sure that you tailor your 1/4 inch seam to the personality of your sewing machine. The accuracy of the 1/4 inch seam allowance really can depend on a variety of factors. And the best way to do it is just to give it a test before you even begin, just to make sure. So there are several ways that you can do this. Marcy Baker has a great product called Sewing Edge reusable vinyl stops for your machine. There's 5 strips. They last forever. She also has what's called the corner cut ruler, and it has a negative 1/4 inch marking on it, which really does a great job marking that 1/4 inch seam. Or you can just use plain old painter's tape on your machine and a ruler where you can test that 1/4 inch seam. I explain it all in my workshop, How to Create the Perfect Quilt Block Every Time. One of the videos focuses completely on that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Number 5, not pinning properly or not pinning at all. This is huge. I prefer to use diagonal pinning for precise alignment when it comes to my intersections. I also like to use my Clover extra fine patchwork pins anytime I am pinning something where I need to really get in close and tight. I also love my Magic 0.5 millimeters flathead pins, just in case I need to pin something when I'm foundation piecing or I need to be able to see that top head of my pin. These are great for that. In my free workshop, How to Create the Perfect Quilt Block Every Time, there's a whole section on pinning and diagonal pinning that I think is really helpful if you're interested in checking out more details on the subject. Number 6, not nesting seams wherever possible. Nesting seams means that we press our fabric pieces in one direction or the other. For example, we will press our seam toward the darker fabrics most of the time. In this particular case, I have pressed both of my seam allowances toward the darker fabric. The way you do that is you make sure that your darker fabric is on the top and you just press this direction so that everything is laying on that side. Now, the same thing is true with this, and as you can see, I want to create a 4 patch. And this is where the nesting happens, right in the middle. So what we're going to do in order to create this nested seam and make the 4 patch is we're going to put these 2 right sides together, and this is where the nesting occurs, right here. You can feel that there is no space in between this seam and this seam. That means it's been properly nested. You also want to make sure that your edges align. Now I used a jelly roll here, so it's got those pinked edges. Usually the pinked edge means that's the edge. You don't want to cut those off. You want to go at the top of the pink. Now I've got this all nice and nested, and I am going to do some diagonal pinning here. Down on one side of the seam allowance, up on the other, and then I'm going to do the same thing on this side. It works. This is going to keep that nested perfectly so that when I do sew my 1/4 inch seam that I know is going to be accurate, and I open this up, I am going to have that perfect intersection right there. That is why it is so important to nest. If you press your seams both in the same direction, you're going to have a lot of bulk on one side and no bulk on the other side. You can figure there's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers of fabric on one side and only 2 on the other side. That can decrease the accuracy of your finished block. So you want to make sure you nest seams anytime you can. There's going to be occasions when you can't, and you just have to deal with that. But anytime you can, this is the best way to achieve that accuracy I'm talking about. You can find more details on this in my free workshop on how to create the perfect quilt block every time. Number 7, not using a pressing solution in a pressing marker in order to create flat seams. If there is nothing else that you pay attention to in this video, this and the diagonal pinning of the seams are the two I think most important. All this is some pressing solution, Best Press, Material Magic, whatever you prefer to use, in an empty marker, usually used for acrylic paint. You can buy them on Amazon cheap, link is in the description. And what you do is you take the tip and you're going to basically paint right on that seam. You can do it this way, or you can open it up and you can paint right here. Once you've done that, you're going to saturate that and place your iron on top of the seam until it's dry. Once it's dry, you are going to have a super flat seam, once again reducing bulk and also giving you that accuracy that you really need when it comes to assembling your blocks and your quilt top. These come in several sizes. I have 15 millimeter, 10 millimeter, 6 millimeter. It doesn't matter. I think they all work really well. You can watch our YouTube video, get perfectly flat seams with this unbelievable pressing method. I think it will be helpful and you can see exactly how to do it. Number 8, not changing your sewing machine needle or your rotary blade often enough. So what's often enough? You should, as a rule of thumb, change your rotary blade every few quilts and your sewing machine needles every project. Now that's my opinion. You may have a different one. That's absolutely fine. What you want to make sure is if your rotary blade is starting to drag, or if you've nicked it, maybe you've dropped it and it has a skip in it, or if it's just really hard to cut with, you need a new blade. It's more important to change out the blade or to change out the needle rather than having to deal with what happens when you don't. A dull blade causes uneven cuts. A dull needle can lead to skip stitches. You want to make sure that you have both of those in good condition before you begin your next project. You can watch 10 quilting tips I wish I knew when I started quilting, and I kind of go into a little more detail on this in that particular video. Number 9. Ignoring fabric grain. I have a great video on this that I will link to, but just in a nutshell, you're best off if you cut on the straight grain when possible. That's going to prevent stretching. If you cut on the bias, you've got a better chance of stretching. Now you can avoid some of that if you spray your fabric ahead of time with a pressing solution, but it's not going to alleviate all of that stretching. So if you take a look at this piece and this piece, they both look identical. They look like they should react exactly the same when I stretch, pull, and piece. But actually, if you take a look, this has been cut on the straight grain. So if I try and pull it this direction, it does not move. That's the straight grain. The cross grain moves a little bit. There's a little stretching, but still not a lot. This piece, however, has been cut on the bias. And if I pick this up, the stretch is huge in this direction, and that can cause major distortion in your quilt blocks. There are some occasions when we have a bias edge that is on the edge of a block or the edge of our quilt, and that's just the way it is. There's nothing we can do. We do the best we can by pressing carefully, trying not to stretch, doing a lot of pinning to make sure everything stays in place, and that will help us to keep that accuracy. But we can have some pretty good bubbles on our quilt if we allow that bias edge to get distorted in any way from the way we handle our fabrics. So you may want to check out the video. It's just a short video with a definition of what the straight grain, cross grain, and bias is. Number 10. Cutting off your block points. This is something that all of us struggle with. I don't care if you're a beginning quilter or a more seasoned quilter. We always have an issue with our points if we're not careful. If you check out the video, it really goes into detail on this subject, but I'm going to show you just briefly what it talks about. If your triangle points disappear, in other words, when you sew your 1/4 inch seam, that triangle point is flat, you've got an issue. That is something that could have to do with your 1/4 inch seam allowance. It could have to do with how straight you've sewn your seam. It could have to do with where your point is in relationship to the rest of the block. But what we want to do is make sure that we don't cut off that point. So all we need with that is a pencil and a pin. And I like to use the magic pin because it's thin, but I can also see where the head is. And what we're going to do is we are going to mark that point on the back side using our pin, turning it horizontally, marking below, in other words, the side closest to the raw edge, making a pencil mark there and sewing through that pencil mark. That's all it takes. Now, if our block is really skewed or it's really off, then we might need to reconsider this and redo the block. But if it's just a tiny bit, this is going to actually help us keep those points no matter what. Check out my video with all the details, really detailed instruction called How to Never Cut Off Points. Number 11, wavy borders. This means that once you've attached your border and you take a look at it, it doesn't hang straight. It's got a wave to it. And there's a reason behind that, and this plagues new quilters especially a lot because it's such an easy fix, but if you don't know how to do it, it becomes an impossible task. What you need to do is you want to have a nice flat border just like this. What it takes is measuring and it takes pinning. Does it add a little extra time? Yes, it does. Is it worth it? Absolutely. When you are adding borders to a quilt, it's best to take at least 2, possibly 3 measurements. You'll want to measure each side of your quilt, and then if they're the same, you know how long to cut your borders. If they're not the same, you'll take the average of those measurements. That's where I like to take the 3 measurements. I measure down each side and down the middle, or across the top and bottom and across the middle. I take the average and then I know what size I need to cut my borders. The second important step is pinning. You'll want to pin the middle first. Find the middle of your border strip, find the middle of your quilt, pin it. Pin each end of your border strip to the end of your quilt top, and then you're going to just pin halfway between your pins, halfway between your pins, halfway between your pins until you've run out of room and you've got it secured. Sew your 1/4 inch seam allowance. Your border will not be wavy. If you just lay your border strip on top of your quilt top without pinning, sew it down the edge, and then hack off the bottom that's a little bit extra, you're going to have a wavy border. If it's a small quilt, you may not notice it. If it's a large quilt, guaranteed it's going to happen. This is such an easy way to avoid that, and it will make quilting your quilt so much easier as well. There is actually a video in our Beginning Quilters course. If you're interested in taking that course, it's called From Novice to Confident Beginner. There are 24 lessons, and I take you from start to finish, basically the start of quilting and the history of quilting, what the benefits of quilting are. Quilting is a whole body experience, all the way through to the last stitch that you put into your quilt and the label you add at the end. Since we're talking about borders, let's talk about number 12. One mistake that beginning quilters, and again many seasoned quilters, make is they are afraid of mitered corners. This is a mitered corner when it comes to our border. They are not difficult. They can give a professional finished look to your quilt. And I have a great video called How to Miter Corners the Easy Way that walks you through the process start to finish. If you follow those instructions, I guarantee you, you are going to have a beautiful mitered corner on your quilt, actually 4 beautiful mitered corners, and you're going to do it every time. It's not hard. It's not time consuming. I find it to be very easy as long as you know the proper way to do it. Number 13. Pre-washing your fabric when needed. And I qualify that with when needed because I don't always pre-wash my fabrics. It depends on the fabric, what I'm using it for, and the color and texture each fabric contains. Now let's take a look at these. I've shown you solids here, but this doesn't just work for solids. If I have a predominantly red, predominantly green, predominantly black, predominantly blue, predominantly vibrant, some fabric that I think may possibly bleed, I am going to cut a chunk off of that fabric. I'm going to put it in some water. I'm going to put a color catcher in there, and I'm going to see if there is any bleeding. That is of prime importance. I cannot tell you how many people actually write to me and say, I've had fabric that has bled because I didn't pre-wash. Now what do I do? There are remedies to take care of that, and hopefully you can get that color out, maybe not. But you can alleviate the issue at the very beginning if you just give all your fabric pieces a test. Test each one for bleeding. Once you've done that, you are good to go. If you prefer unwashed fabric when you're creating your quilt, which many of us do, be aware there can be some shrinkage when you put those pieces together and create your quilt and then wash it. and there is always that chance that you can have some kind of bleeding from any fabric. So again, my advice, check it out first. I have a video on pre-washing fabrics that you may be interested in. Number 14, not checking bobbin thread before sewing. That hits all of us. You don't want to run out of bobbin mid-seam or mid-project or mid-block. That can be so frustrating. So you want to make sure that you check to see that you've got a pretty good bobbin at the beginning of your sewing project, and then check it along the way. Some machines actually notify you when your bobbin is getting low. Others you have to keep checking yourself. Don't play bobbin chicken. Sometimes we win, but more often than not we lose. And if you keep some extra bobbins already wound, ready to go, that makes your block assembly even more efficient. Number 15, not practicing on scrap fabric first. We hate to practice, don't we? We don't want to practice, we just want to get in there and we want to quilt. But if you practice just on a couple of pieces of fabric, some scraps, it's going to save you so much time in the end. So before you start your project, and you know, I like to do this every time, just because my tape on my machine, my 1/4" seam guide, wears out after a while. Sometimes it moves a little bit, just depending on what we're doing, and so I like to give it a double check every time. So far so good, but you just never know, and you don't want to waste any of your fabric pieces just because your seam allowance is off. So before you get started, the first thing I do is I use 2.5" squares. I cut two 2.5" squares and I sew them right sides together. Once I've sewn them together with my accurate 1/4" seam, then I measure. And I want to make sure, 2 places, that my 2¼ line goes from edge to middle, which it does, and that my 4½ line lines up perfectly here. That means I have a perfect 1/4" seam right in the middle. That's one way you can do it. Another way that you can do it is you can actually take 3 pieces and sew them together, and then you'll check this middle piece. This is a 2½ 2½ 2½ Once I have sewn this in, this should be 2 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and measure, and look, I've got a perfect 2 inch. I also know that this is correct and accurate. Either way works. And here's a bonus tip for you. And again, this affects all of us, seasoned quilters and beginning quilters and intermediate quilters. How to use your seam ripper. Many of us never knew that that red ball on our seam ripper is really important. Check out my video in how to create the perfect quilt block every time. I'll show you how to use a seam ripper. So there you have it. 15 mistakes that are easy to fix. I hope these tips help you feel more confident in your quilting. Which one surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments. I love hearing from you. And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with a quilting friend who might need these tips too. For even more quilting help, be sure to check out my free workshop called How to Create the Perfect Quilt Block Every Time. I'll link it in the description below, and it's on our website, joyfulandmerryquilting.com. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, I am always trying to be joyful, but I will always be merry. Thanks for watching.